Europe is home to some of the most advanced countries in the world, from the United Kingdom and France to Germany and Italy. But despite this, the European Space Agency has been quite irrelevant to the average person for many decades at this point. At first, it was just the world powers that were outshining them, like the USSR and the United States. Eventually, this started to include a few developing countries as well, like China and India. Today, it seems like SpaceX and even Blue Origin are accomplishing more than the ESA. So, what in the world happened to the ESA? Well, before we get into the video, I wanted to make it clear that just because the ESA's achievements aren't as well known, doesn't mean that the ESA hasn't accomplished significant feats throughout their lifetime. With that being said, let's jump into the history and accomplishments of the ESA. Throughout the early 1960s, the United States and the USSR were in a heated race to prove the dominance of their respective political and economical systems. And one of the manifestations of this desire was the race to space and subsequently the moon. Given that the Soviet Union and NASA were by far the leaders in the race, many prominent scientists in Europe decided to simply join one side or the other following World War II. This not only accelerated the leads of both the US and the Soviet Union, but this also significantly reduced the amount of manpower European countries had at their disposal. As a result, most European countries quickly realized that they alone could not even come close to competing against the leaders. Thus, when two scientists, Pierre Auger and Eduardo Amaldi, suggested forming a joint space organization in 1958, several European countries swiftly jumped onto the opportunity. This led to the creation of a commission dubbed GEARS in 1960, where representatives from 10 European countries met up to discuss how exactly a conglomerate space organization would work. After 2 years of debate and discussion, the politicians would agree to provide 8 years of funding for two separate space organizations, named ESRO and ELDO. ESRO, or the European Space Research Organization, was established to develop a spacecraft. Meanwhile, ELDO, or the European Launch Development Organization, was established to develop a launch system. By separating launch development and spacecraft development, Europe hoped that they could accelerate the development process, but they would soon realize that this wasn't all that effective. Anyways, once the two organizations finally came to life, we would see a slew of new smaller organizations being created. For instance, in 1966, ESRIN, or the European Space Research Institute, was created to monitor the health of the Earth by launching various environmental satellites. Soon after, in 1967, ESOC, or the European Space Operations Center, would be opened, and this would serve as a control center for the other organizations. Moving on to 1968, ESTEC, or the European Space Research and Technology Center, would be opened. To be completely honest, I have no clue why they decided to open so many different organizations, as many of them seem redundant and completely unnecessary. Fortunately, they too soon came to the same conclusion in 1972. At the time, ESRO had made some decent progress, but ELDO wasn't doing so hot. They were dealing with several technological problems, cost overruns, and political disputes. As a result, ELDO would be downsized and put on the back burner in 1972. However, it wasn't completely dismantled quite yet. Meanwhile, ESRO would get the opportunity to work on their first major project in conjunction with NASA. In 1973, ESRO and NASA would form an agreement to work together. ESRO was tasked with the job of developing Spacelab, which was a science module that was supposed to be placed in the Space Shuttle. In return, NASA would allow European astronauts to join in on their missions. Following this agreement, ESRO would begin construction and testing of the Spacelab in 1974, and the Spacelab would eventually be used on 25 Space Shuttle flights between 1983 and 1998. While development of the Spacelab was ongoing, we would see further consolidation of the European space effort. In 1974, ELDO would be dismantled and the remaining resources would be merged with ESRO to create the ESA in 1975. That same year, the ESA would launch COS-B, which was their own first major scientific research mission. COS-B was designed to study cosmic gamma rays, but what made it especially significant was its longevity. The ESA only expected the satellite to operate for 2 years, but it ended up working for 6 years, which really showcased the quality of European space technology. Moving on, in 1978, Canada would become a cooperating state to the ESA, and the ESA would join forces with NASA and the UK on another project, which was launching IUE. IUE, or the International Ultraviolet Explorer, would become the first high-orbit telescope, and it would be operational for a full 18 years. Transitioning into the 1980s, we would see the ESA really focus on their own launch program with the Ariane program. The Ariane program started to take shape after the dismantling of ELDO, but since it got defunded in 1974, the Europeans had to come up with a new launch system, which led them to the Ariane program. The first Ariane launch would take place in 1979, and it would serve as a solid commercial launch vehicle throughout the 1980s. Ariane 1 wasn't reusable like the Space Shuttle, but considering that the Space Shuttle cost so much to reuse in the first place, Ariane 1 wasn't that behind economically anyways. Moreover, the ESA would consistently update the Ariane rocket throughout the 80s to make it more reliable and cost-effective. By 1988, the ESA would come up with the Ariane 4, which would complete missions between 1988 and 2003. And this rocket is really what would establish the ESA as a leading space organization. Aside from this, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the ESA would also work on one more major program, which was the Hermes Spacecraft. The Hermes Spacecraft was designed to be the ESA's first crewed launch vehicle, and it was slated to be able to carry 4 to 6 astronauts into orbit. Originally, it was planned to be launched with the Ariane 4 rocket, but the Hermes spacecraft would quickly become too heavy for the Ariane 4 to handle. So, the ESA would set on developing the Ariane 5, which was expected to allow the ESA to complete crewed missions into space. However, the Challenger disaster would really put a halt on these plans. You see, NASA was on a great run throughout the 1960s and 70s, and this really built up some confidence around spaceflight. I mean, Apollo 13 literally went wrong in the middle of space, and NASA was still able to bring back the crew safely. But the Challenger disaster really grounded how dangerous spaceflight really was, and that things could still go wrong despite the smartest minds in the world working on making things go right. As a result, several additional safety precautions would be introduced after the disaster. Accounting for these new safety precautions added significant weight onto Hermes, which forced the ESA to reduce the crew capacity to 3 astronauts. Even with these reductions though, Hermes was expected to weigh 21,000 kilograms, which would really push the limits of the Ariane 5 rocket. This obstacle, along with a variety of other delays and cost overruns, eventually resulted in the Hermes spacecraft being cancelled in 1992. And finally, that brings us into the ESA's final major project, which is Mars Express. As the name suggests, Mars Express was a mission to Mars in 2003. During the mission, the ESA successfully landed Beagle 2 onto the surface of Mars, which marked the first fully European mission to any planet. Just 2 years later, the ESA would land the Huygens probe on the surface of Titan, which was the first landing ever in the outer solar system. Since then, the ESA has made significant contributions to the ISS and sent several astronauts to the space station with the help of NASA. So, as you can see, the ESA does have a pretty rich history, and we just scratched the surface of their contributions and accomplishments. But then, why is the ESA so irrelevant in the public eye? Well, I think there are 2 very simple reasons for this, with the first being a lack of place. When it comes to space organizations, there are a few very clear sectors. First, we have the developed space leaders, which are of course the US and Russia. Next, we have the developing space contenders, which include countries like China and India. And finally, we have the private space competitors like SpaceX and Blue Origin. But the ESA doesn't really fit into any of these categories. The ESA is of course not on the level of NASA or Roscosmos. But at the same time, it doesn't really make sense to compare them with China or India. You have to keep in mind that a lot of the countries involved in the ESA are some of the most developed countries in the world. Meanwhile, China and India are still very much developing countries, so it's not really fair to compare them with the ESA. As for the private space industry, the ESA is not private, so that completely disqualifies them from that category. As a result, the ESA doesn't really have a clear ranking within the space hierarchy. Their accomplishments are more comparable to that of developing countries, but European countries are actually developed countries. So the ESA is kind of just lost in space. The other major reason that the average person doesn't really care about the ESA is because the ESA has not completed a crew mission and they have no plans to do one in the imminent future either. Sending probes and rovers into space and other planets are great feats, but crewed missions are really what get the masses interested, whether that be to the ISS, the Moon, or Mars. Take SpaceX for instance. Space enthusiasts have been excited about SpaceX for several years at this point. However, the event that really garnered the attention of the masses was getting astronauts to the ISS. Considering that the ESA has mostly played a background role throughout their lifetime, it's not too surprising that the average person is not too interested. But don't let the lack of attention fool you. The European Space Agency is not actually relevant by any means when it comes to space technology. Why do you guys think the ESA is so underrated? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you guys think the ESA deserves more credit. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and to consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.